Alright guys, so let's take a look at how evolution and change over time and adaptation and natural selection have affected the life history traits of these populations that we're talking about. We could be talking about plants, we could be talking about oak trees or fish in the ocean or mammals that live on land. It doesn't matter. All of the same sort of aspects of evolution and natural selection have affected many of them in the same way. An organism's life history comprises the traits that affect its schedule of reproduction and survival, which really affects the demography that we've been talking about. So we're talking about the age at which reproduction begins. Does that creature become reproductively active very early in its lifespan, or is it a later reproducing type creature? How often the organism reproduces. Some creatures reproduce quite often and throughout their entire life. Some only have a very short time period within their life that they reproduce, and others perhaps only reproduce infrequently. That is a very important obviously the control of reproduction and the addition of births to a new population. How many offspring are produced during each reproductive cycle? There are some creatures like humans and some of the larger animals that only produce 1 or 2 offspring per birth, and there are other creatures that may produce many offspring, particularly small things such as insects and the like. Life history traits are evolutionary outcomes reflected in the development, physiology, and behavior of an organism. So except for humans, most living creatures don't really consciously choose when to reproduce or how many offspring to have, so these factors have been basically chosen or affected by natural selection and evolution over time. One good example of some of the differences that can arise because of the different life histories of different species is whether or not they exhibit what's called simulparity or heteroparity reproduction. Species that exhibit simulparity or Big Bang reproduction reproduce once and die, and we'll talk about why they might do it that way. The other species that we might look at are called heteroparity. Heteroparity is repeated reproduction, and they reproduce offspring repeatedly throughout their lives. There's a number of conditions that affect this, but one of those is the environment itself. Highly variable, basically not dependable type of environment, unpredictable environment, they tend to favor Big Bang reproduction, this simulparity type of reproduction, while more stable, dependable environments tend to favor repeated reproduction, heteroparity type of reproduction. A good example of the simulparity or Big Bang reproduction is seen here in this agave plant that grows in the desert areas, sometimes called the century plant. It will grow for many years, and then it will finally put forth this massive flowering structure that you see, this giant stalk with these structures on the top. This is actually the flowering of the plant, and once it does flower, after it does flower and reproduce, it tends to basically die off. It doesn't last much longer than its reproductive portion here, but it may live for many years before it finally reproduces. So this is Big Bang reproduction or simulparity type reproduction, and again, in an environment like the desert where it's very difficult to survive, you probably are not going to put as much energy into reproducing over and over again, because the chance of those offspring surviving is very low. So you're going to save up your resources and basically reproduce in one giant flourish, and this is what the century plant does. You can compare that to other creatures such as, say, a cockroach, which will reproduce throughout its life and produce many offspring, and they basically deal with their problems in a different way. So the cockroach would be a good example of heteroparity, repeated reproduction, where the century plant would be a good example of simulparity or Big Bang reproduction. When we talk about demography and changes in population and reproduction, we also have to keep in mind that there's a little bit of a trade-off between reproduction and survival. When you reproduce and you bring offspring into the world, it doesn't matter if you are a human or a bird or a plant, you are giving up potentially some of your own survival. You are trading off because there are only finite resources, so there's a bit of a trade-off between survival and reproduction. A good example they use in the textbook is this trade-off between survival and paternal care in European kestrels. A kestrel is like a little hawk or a falcon that lives over in Europe. And they have a very good little chart here that shows that. They show that the brood size, which is the nest size, the number of eggs and babies that they raise, has a direct correlation with their survival rate the following winter. So when they have a smaller brood size, in other words, they laid fewer eggs and raised fewer babies, their surviving percentage the next winter tends to be higher. When they have a normal brood size, it's a little bit lower, and when they have an enlarged brood size, you can see it's even lower here. So the extra parental care that it takes to raise numerous young has an effect on the survival percentage of the adults themselves. So there really is this trade-off between keeping yourself alive and reproducing and keeping your offspring alive, and you can see that shown here. Now, different creatures have different ways of dealing with this trade-off, or different ways of dealing with this problem. Some creatures, like for example the plant shown here, the dandelion, produce a huge number of small seeds, a huge number of offspring, ensuring that at least some of them will grow and eventually reproduce. While the vast majority of these dandelion seeds will not grow up to be full-grown plants and reproduce, it produces so many of them that sure, there's going to be a lot of them that land on the concrete or get washed down a storm drain, but plenty of them are still going to find a suitable spot and reproduce. So this is basically just a numbers game. You reproduce so much or so often that you're bound to have some make it into adulthood. A second way of dealing with that is to have a more moderate, a lower number of offspring, but put more energy and time into those offspring. And a good example here is this Brazil nut tree. This tree produces not nearly as many seeds. You can see here is the seed pod with the seeds inside the Brazil nuts, and it's not nearly as many as the dandelion, but they have a lot more energy stored in them, a lot more effort goes into making this seed pod. So basically the Brazil nut tree is taking the opposite tactic. It's making fewer offspring, but it's investing more energy into those fewer in the hopes that they'll have a greater chance of survival. As a population ecologist, you might want to try to understand why do some species choose these different methods for dealing with the various factors that they have to face. I mean, why does the dandelion, why did natural selection allow it or cause it to choose this particular process of producing many offspring, and why did natural selection or evolution cause the tree, the Brazil nut tree, to choose a different method? So those would be called K and R selection, and we would look at those and kind of divide out the different species that we were looking at and kind of subgroup them, their various traits, into either K-selected traits or R-selected traits. Remember, the life history traits we're talking about are the age at which reproduction begins. Why do some creatures begin reproduction very early in their life while others wait quite a long time? The second one is how often the organisms reproduce. Again, why do some creatures only reproduce a few times in their entire life? Maybe even one time in its entire life, if we're talking about simple parity reproduction. And why do others reproduce many times? And then third, how many offspring are produced during each reproductive cycle? Is it like the dandelion where they produce many offspring? Or is it going to be more like, say, a human or a chimpanzee or a whale, or even the Brazil nut tree, where they produce far fewer offspring, but they invest more energy and time into the reproduction of that 1 or 2 or 5 offspring? So when we look at these different traits, we kind of divide them into what's called K-selected or R-selected. Remember, K has to do with carrying capacity. K, the big letter K, stands for carrying capacity. Remember, the small little r stands for the per capita rate of increase. How many more births do you have than deaths? So some of these traits are called K-selection or K-selected traits, and they're what we would call density dependent. They are traits that are favored in high population densities where the population is operating right at or near its carrying capacity. So certain traits are beneficial if you live in a high density population that's near the carrying capacity, and those would be K-selection traits. They are density dependent, they are affected by the density of the population, and these are traits that would be more favorable if you live in a high density environment. The other type would be R selection, and these are density independent. They're not really affected by the number or the density of the population. They select for life history traits that maximize reproduction. So they are just all about making more births than deaths. And this is going to be favored in low population densities where the population is attempting to maximize that R value. So you might think about this, say for example the dandelion, where the dandelion is reproducing as many seeds as possible. It is trying to get that R value to be as high as possible. That's an R selected trait. Whereas the fact that humans have, say, 1 or 2 infants at a time, that's more of a K selection trait. In a high population density area, it might be more advantageous to spend more energy and time on fewer babies than to just try to get that reproductive rate up as high as possible. So K selection is density dependent, and it tends to be more favored in high population densities, and R selection, or R selected traits, are more favored in low population densities, and they are density independent. So those are the two kind of areas or categories that we can put some of these selection traits in, and we try to figure out why did this creature evolve this particular habit or this particular way of birth and death and reproductive cycle. And of course, like I've already said 5 or 6 times, these are oversimplifications. I mean, most creatures, the various traits that they have about them don't cleanly fit into just R or K. They tend to be kind of a mix of that. But these ideas of K selected traits and R selected traits, they do help us kind of figure out why this creature has developed these traits or these habits as far as reproduction and life cycle. We're going to take a break right there. When we come back, we'll be at concept 53.5, and that's going to be talking about traits that are density dependent, where different traits are affected by how many creatures there are in a population. We'll be right back.